Welcome back, fellow travelers. I hope you're finding it easy to stay caught up. And if you aren't, that you're making sure you run quickly and catch up with us. This week, we find ourselves in Jerusalem at the temple. Let me just give you a little view of our temple here. But before we go to that and look at the temple and why we're here, I want us to talk a bit about John, the one who we're walking with and who wrote this book that we're using and this road that we're on. John writes his gospel from a different point of view than, say, Matthew and Luke. As we will look at Matthew and Luke when we get there and walk with them, we find that they begin their journey at the birth of Christ. John doesn't begin his journey. He doesn't even talk about the birth of Christ. Where does John begin? We saw last week that John began before Christ was ever born and makes it very clear that Jesus's existence began before he ever became Jesus, that he was the Son of God and God the Son before he ever came to this earth. John, he has a motive for his writings, and what is it that he wants us to know clearly from his writings? We find that in his key verse. If I were looking for one key verse that summed up John's writings, all of them in John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, they're summed up in John chapter 20, verse 31. These things have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. And so John has one motive, that you know that Jesus is the Messiah, that you know that Jesus is the Son of God, and that he existed before time. We also find that John uses two words almost to an extreme. If you look up the word love and look up the word abide, you will find that the bulk of those times usages are found in John's writings. John knew much about love, and in understanding love, he knew the importance of abiding. And we will look at those things in time as well. But I just want to mention how John sees himself. If we were reading Peter's writings, we would expect Peter to say something like, Peter, the disciple that loved Jesus. And yet John doesn't describe himself that way. When John describes himself, he describes himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. John was secure in Jesus's love. Is it any wonder that he can write so much about it? And so there, as you're reading through books, as you're journeying on different roads, look for key words, key phrases, key verses. And definitely the key verse, John 20:31, and the key words are love and abide. John begins his journey once he substantiates Jesus existed before, and he is not just one who came into the world, but he is the Son of God. Once he substantiates that, then he picks up Jesus's ministry from the time Jesus is baptized. And quickly we find ourselves, after our introduction to the things that we looked at last week, now we find ourselves walking with Jesus and his disciples, and we are traveling through an area called Samaria. When we get to John chapter 4, and it tells us that Jesus was going through Samaria and he meets a woman at the well. There are two shocking things there. First of all, that he was traveling through Samaria. Second of all, that he was talking to a woman when he was by himself, which is a cultural thing you didn't do, let alone a Samaritan woman. Now, when we say, let alone a Samaritan woman, so what is so important about Samaria? To understand that, I want to show you a map. This is a map of Israel in the time of Christ. And we see three main sections that we're looking at on this side of the Jordan. We see the Galilee, where we spent our time last week. We see three main sections on the west side of the Jordan. in this top part, the Galilee, this is where we have been spending our time in our last week together. And we see that this is the Sea of Galilee up here. We've looked at Bethsaida, Capernaum, Magdala. These are important cities around the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus did the majority of his ministry. And as we come down, the Jordan descends, and then we come to an area known as Samaria. And then the closer we get to Jerusalem, you'll see Jerusalem right here. Jerusalem was the epicenter of the religious order. And Jerusalem, a lot of tension, and we'll understand more about Jerusalem as our journey goes on. But remembering that Jesus started in the Galilee was known as the Galilee of the Gentiles. Seen as the farther away you got from the epicenter, the more mixture, the more Gentiles you would have. And as the Jews that were in Galilee, when they would make their way down to Jerusalem for their festivals, which we know that there were 3 festivals a year that God had said, you are to present yourself to me. The men of Israel were to present themselves to God in Jerusalem and at the temple. But when they would leave the Galilee, whether Nazareth or anywhere else, they would follow the Jordan River down and descend this way until they would come to Jericho, and then they would go up to Jerusalem. It would seem like an easier route for some of these cities just to go straight through Samaria. But a good Jew wouldn't go through Samaria. What was wrong with Samaria and with the Samaritans? To understand that, we have to go back into history. We have to go back quite a ways, because we have to go clear back to the time of Solomon's son, Rehoboam. And we know that during the time of Rehoboam, there was a civil war, so to speak, a clash. And as a result, the nation divided itself. And we'll talk more about the particulars of that. But I want us to see, how did the nation divide itself? Once again, I want you to look at a map with me. This map shows us the division of the kingdoms. In the northern part, this became the kingdom of Israel. The southern part, down here, became known as the kingdom of Judah. In the northern part, we see that Samaria became the capital, and this whole area took on the name of Samaria, just like New York, New York. It was Samaria of Samaria. And so this became the northern kingdom. We also know that Jeroboam, who ruled in this northern kingdom, was afraid that the people would make their journeys down to Jerusalem as the law commanded them to do 3 times a year. And he was afraid he would lose control. So what he did was he took 2 golden calves. He set one in the north, and then he set one in the south. And what he said is, these are your gods. This is your God. This is Yahweh. And so just like when Aaron, will read how Aaron makes a golden calf, and he's replicating those golden calves. And he's saying, okay, now on these times when you're supposed to go to Jerusalem, don't go down to Jerusalem, but go to these areas that I have designated. And so as a result, there were places that were designated as worship to the Samaritans. Now, who were the Samaritans? To understand that, we have to again go back to this divided kingdom. We know that the northern kingdom, when the children of Israel were taken captive into Babylon by the king of Assyria, the northern kingdom was the first to fall. And that northern kingdom would have been Samaria. And after the kingdoms fell, We read in 2 Kings 17, and you can read it for yourself, 2 Kings 17, verses 24 through 41. And if you will take time to read that, you'll find that that the king of Assyria took people from Assyria, from 5 different cities in Assyria, one of them being Babylon, and he took people from those cities and he brought them and settled them in Samaria. The only problem was God was not pleased with this, and so God sent lions, and there were people being killed. So they sent to the king of Samaria and said, "Hey, we don't know how to deal with this God, and we're provoking him, so we need help." And so what the king of Samaria did, he took one priest who had been taken captive from Samaria, and he brought that priest into Samaria and said, "Okay, now teach them about the God of this land and how to appease the God of this land." Now, if you go back to what I said before, that there was a worship of Yahweh, but it was a tainted worship of Yahweh. It was the worship of the golden calf. And they also said, remember, don't go down to Jerusalem. And so when you hear this Samaritan woman saying, you people say it's in Jerusalem that we worship, where we say it's here in this mountain that we worship. What she is referring to is she's referring to what they had been taught by the priest who came to Samaria to give them understanding of Yahweh and his ways. And so we find that in Samaria, up even until the time of Christ, there was a lot of perversion of the understanding of the Jewish ways. We also find that because the Assyrians were sent down to the area of Samaria, that there were Jews that had been left behind. And so they began to intermarry with one another. And so Samaritans, by and large, were, for a better term, half-breeds. They were part Assyrian, they were part Jewish, and depending on who was top dog at the time, that's what they claimed. Well, I'm Assyrian or I'm Jewish. And so they fluctuated back and forth. They were easily swayed. So the Jews looked at Samaritans with much disdain. And so when Jesus is coming down to present himself for the festival and the feast days, Jesus goes right through Samaria, which was, again, unheard of. You just stayed to the Jordan River, followed that down. You didn't come through Samaria. And so we see Jesus, he defies their way of thinking, and his heart and his openness to embrace people, all manners of people, even those that were considered disdained. And we will see more about the Samaritans as we go on in our journeys and hear some other things that Jesus has to say about Samaritans. And so we journey down with Jesus to the feast, and before he leaves for this first feast that we read about, which is going to be the Feast of Passover, found in John chapter 6, before he leaves, he does an amazing miracle. And this time what he does is, when he's up near the Galilee, he feeds 5,000. He feeds 5,000. We know that he feeds them bread and he feeds them fish. You'll read all the particulars on that story, and John will tell you all about it. But what I want us to see here is that Jesus is about to go down, descend, and then go up to Jerusalem for Passover. What is Passover all about? Well, we know that Passover is about the Passover lamb, but we also know that Passover is called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We'll be talking more about that on our journey up ahead, so we'll save some of that for that. But Do you notice that this Feast of Unleavened Bread, God told them, I don't want any leaven in your homes. I don't want any leaven in your towns. I want you to get all the leaven out before this feast. And then I want you to eat unleavened bread for 7 days. So what are the people's minds thinking about? They're thinking about the fact that they've got to get rid of leaven out of their homes. They're thinking about bread. They're thinking about the fact that soon they're going to be eating unleavened bread. So their minds are set on bread. Is it any wonder that Jesus takes this time, as we read in John 6 and verse 4, it says, now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near. It's at this time that Jesus takes the opportunity to give them bread. Why? Because he's taking the event and what their minds are centered on, and he's showing them, I am the fulfillment of this feast day. We see Jesus do this on more than one occasion. When you get to John 7, verse 37, it says, now on the last day, the great day of the feast, Jesus stood up and cried out, saying, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the scripture said, from his innermost being will flow rivers of living water. Once again, we see that Jesus is coming to Jerusalem to present himself, as the scriptures say. But this Feast of Tabernacles also had another name. What was the other name of this feast? It was also known as the Feast of Water Drawing. Why was it called the Feast of Water Drawing? Because for 7 days there was a ritual, a service that was performed by the priest. Each morning, a priest would go down to the pool of Siloam, and he would take a golden pitcher. And when he got to the golden pitcher, when he got to the pool of Siloam, he would fill the golden pitcher with water from the pool of Siloam. And as he's going, he's followed by a music procession. This was with much fanfare. And he would carry that vessel, he would take it back to the temple. And when he arrived back at the temple, he would arrive just as the pieces of the sacrifice were being laid on the altar, and it was coming closer to the time of the morning sacrifice. As he would enter, there would be a priest, the priests that were standing around, that were the musicians, they would sound 3 long blasts on the trumpet, which would let them know that the priest had arrived with the water. As that priest would come through the water gate. You ever wondered why it's called the water gate? He would come through the water gate, and they would hear those blasts, knowing that they had arrived. And then as the priest carrying the water would come in, he would be joined by the priest who was also carrying a vessel, but this vessel contained the wine for the drink offering, or the libation that would go daily with the offering. And then together they would ascend to the altar, turn left, and when they would get there, there would be 2 narrow openings. Each one had a funnel. And each of these openings would lead to the base of the altar. The funnel that was closer to the east side was a little bit wider than the one on the west side, and the wine was poured into the eastern opening, while the water was poured into the side that was closer to the west. As they would pour this, the priests and certainly the people would join in, and they would begin to recite Psalm 113, 114, 115, 116, 117, and 118. So they would recite these 6 psalms. These 6 psalms were known as the Hallel. And so they would, and remember, they didn't carry their Bibles with them. They would know these psalms by heart. And so they would chant these psalms. Can you imagine what it must have sounded like with all the people there? And as they would begin to chant these psalms, We also know that there was music that they were set to. So they would sing and chant these Psalms, the Hallel. And while they were chanting them, this is when the pouring out would happen. And it is believed that after the Hallel, this is when Jesus stood up and he cried to them, "Is anyone thirsty?" Once again, we see that Jesus took the occasion of the festival, just as he did with the bread. He made them know that he is the bread of life. Now, as they're pouring out the water, once again, he lets them know that he is the waters of life. You know, there's all these little things that can be missed along the way if we just walk with our heads down or have tunnel vision. But as we begin to see, we see the beauty of how Jesus used every event to declare truth to the people and to his disciples, and to make them know that he truly was what John was declaring him to be. He is the Messiah. He is the one that we've been looking for. And he is the Son of God, God the Son, the one who has created all things that are in existence. So enjoy the reading and just take time to smell the roses and to look around and look at those little clues and the little breadcrumbs along the way. And don't miss the beauty of the words that Jesus spoke and how clearly John is making them known to us. So enjoy your journey. I pray that this week is filled with lots of revelations and lots of beautiful views as you walk your journey. Bless you.